Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Georgia Archives. My name is Penny Cliff, and I'm pleased to serve as your moderator today. Thank you for joining us for the Declaration of Independence at 250, a revolutionary idea that established a new nation, presented by Clayton State University. Today's program commemorates the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and explores its lasting significance in American history. We are especially pleased that Georgia's copy of the Declaration of Independence is currently on display here at the Georgia Archives as part of this anniversary observance. Now, our format is simple. Each panelist over here will speak for approximately 15 minutes. And when they're finished, after each one is finished, we will follow with audience questions. And you should have like a 3x5 note card, and we'll pass them to the end and I'll read them out. Please feel free to write your questions down on these note cards. Following the panel discussion, there's our time for questions, as I said, and the closing remarks by Clayton State University President Dr. George Lewis. Then afterwards, you may have seen this. Please join us downstairs in the lobby for cake, and it looks wonderful, and refreshments. Christopher Davidson is our state archivist and associate vice chancellor. He's going to offer a few remarks before the cake is cut. So we encourage everyone to visit the exhibit. You're going to love it, and enjoy the reception afterwards. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Adam Tate. Dr. Tate is professor of history and chair of the Department of Humanities at Clayton State University. Dr. Tate has taught at Clayton State since 2004 and has served as chair of the Department of Humanities since 2015. His teaching interests include 19th century America, the American founding, and Southern history. His research focuses on Southern intellectual history. Dr. Tate will speak about the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress, and the idea of self-government. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Adam Tate.
I appreciate everyone coming today. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for coming, and Dr. Drake and Robin, thank you very much for having us here. All right, get started. So modern Americans commonly view the Declaration of Independence as stating the creedal principles of the United States. Many characterize the document as the expression of an American philosophy: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal. But the ubiquitous rights-focused interpretation obscures another influential aspect of the Declaration, its presentation of self-government. During the discussion of independence during the spring of 1776, congressmen assumed two broad ways of organizing politically: empire and confederation. Empire, they saw, was imposed from outside or from afar without the consent of the governed. Confederation, in their view, emerged from the people themselves as self-governing communities joined together for security. As American congressmen came to support independence, they uniformly asserted that confederation would be part of that decision. In fact, the call for an American confederation was one of the most important aspects of the decision for independence, and allows us to appreciate the popular sovereignty Congress claimed in the Declaration. Now, during the late 17th and 18th centuries, many European thinkers understood their continent to be a state system. The idea was that Europe was a community of equal nations, each possessing sovereignty and subject to the law of nature, accessible through reason. For many 18th century European intellectuals, the vision of Europe as a community of equal nations under a rational law was an axiomatic principle. All thinking about geopolitics and international relations flowed from that vision. But axioms are bedrock principles and are not necessarily proven by experience. Instead of equal nations under a rule of rational law, Western Europe was a realm of three great empires competing for global dominance. Spain, France, and Great Britain contended for power throughout the 18th century, building large fleets, standing armies, and merchant classes. Though they were not small nations content with a political and economic world within their European borders, but possessed empires. For the small countries of Europe, there seemed to be only two practical solutions in the face of overwhelming force. Either a country could become a client state of an empire and thus lose its self-governing character, or it could confederate. That is, it could create an alliance with other vulnerable neighbors for defense. By the second half of the 18th century, many European statesmen considered a balance of power produced through confederation and alliance as the best way to preserve national power and independence. Even though American colonists had participated rather enthusiastically in the wars of the British Empire during the 18th century, many began to lose the imperial faith during the 1770s. By 1775, American congressmen routinely portrayed the British Empire as a system of domination and oppression based on force. Its claims of bringing peace and prosperity were seen as platitudes that obscured the oppression of people in its orbit. In a 1775 letter to Gouverneur Morris, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia referred to the British policies as their cruel system that aimed to reduce millions yet unborn to the abyss of slavery. Several weeks later, Congress concurred in its July 6, 1775 declaration setting forth the causes and necessities of taking up arms, written by John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson. The delegates protested that their complaints for the previous 10 years had been ignored by the British government. Instead of a moderate political response, Parliament adopted an insidious maneuver calculated to divide us, to establish perpetual auction of taxations where colonies should bid against colonies. It was the old trick of divide and conquer. Congress complained, we are reduced to the alternative of choosing an unconditional submission to tyranny of irritated ministers or resistance by force. In choosing resistance, Congress explained, we fight not for glory or for conquest. In other words, the colonists rejected the motivations of the British imperialists. A disgusted Benjamin Franklin in late July 1776 identified the characteristics of the British imperial system as fondness for conquest as a warlike nation, lust of dominion as an ambitious one, and a thirst for a gainful monopoly as a commercial. Conquest, dominion, monopoly, these were the tools of empire. Instead of guarding liberty, Britain's empire threatened. Americans then fought not simply one bad ruler, but against an entire corrupt system. The corruption necessitated separation and the creation of an alternative political organization. Between 1775 and 1777, congressmen argued for union and confederation as the alternative to empire. In fact, what is stunning about congressional correspondence is the overwhelming consensus that confederation was the specific union the colony should seek. In July 1775, Benjamin Franklin presented to Congress a plan for confederation. Given the dialogue about the oppressive system of the British Empire, Franklin's confederation rested on a strikingly different foundation. In Article 2, Franklin describes the confederation as a firm league of friendship. Article 3 continues by affirming that each colony shall enjoy and retain as much as it may think fit of its own present laws, customs, rights, privileges, and peculiar jurisdictions within its own limit. In other words, consent and cooperation were the animating principles of confederation. This was a far cry from coercion and domination, the spirit of empire. Franklin considered the purpose of confederation to be the common defense of the colonies and security of their liberties, properties, the safety of their persons and families, and their mutual and general welfare. This system, he thought, could offer the security needed. Now, in 1775, Congress set aside Franklin's plan as premature. But during the spring of 1776, as delegates moved toward declaring independence, calls for Confederation became urgent. Congressmen believed that a Declaration of Independence, coupled with a strong Confederation, would allow them to establish diplomatic relations with European nations, particularly France, who could provide access to markets and even military assistance against Britain. On May 11, 1776, New Hampshire delegate William Whipple remarked, "A confederation permanent and lasting ought, in my opinion, to be the next thing, and I hope is not far off." Similarly, John Adams, who had been stressing for a couple of months the need for a confederation, told his wife Abigail on May 17th, "Confederation will be necessary for our internal concord." Congress, however, declared independence previous to agreeing on a confederation. Now, the Declaration of Independence prepared for Confederation in its final paragraph. Here's what it said. It said that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that is free and independent states. They have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. The free and independent states were now part of the state system, and no other power had control over them. Finally, these free states could confederate for protection. In fact, shortly after the Declaration was passed, Congress debated the first draft of what would become the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution for the United States. The Confederate vision of power emerging from the people of each state and building through mutual consent was then part and parcel of the Declaration itself. A peace conference in September 1776 between Lord Richard Howe and 3 congressional delegates serves as a fitting example of how Congress understood the Declaration. Howe had arrived in New York with a large military force after Congress declared independence, and by August had taken Long Island. In early September, Howe told Congress that he had a peace commission and sought to end the conflict honorably. On September 6, Congress agreed to send Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Edward Rutledge to meet with Howe. The issue, however, was that Howe would not recognize them as representatives of an independent United States. In other words, Britain refused to accept the equality of the new country, thus signaling it did not see the United States as part of the state system. To Lord Howe, returning to the empire was their future. At the discussions in New York, John Adams told Howe that the resolutions of the Congress to declare the independency was not taken up upon their own authority, that they had been instructed to do so by all the colonies, and that it was not in their power to treat otherwise than as independent states. In other words, authority came from the people in each state. Adams had no authority other than that granted through the independent states. Franklin concurred, telling Howe that it would take as much time for the American representatives to refer and get an answer from their constituents as it would the British commissioners to get fresh instructions from home, which he supposed might be done in about 3 months. Franklin thus admitted that he, as a congressman, had no independent authority to negotiate. All authority came from the independent states. And on September 17th, Congress summed up the committee's members' sentiments, holding that it was bound by the voice of their constituents. Congress had no power to enter into conference or receive any propositions on the subject of peace, which do not as a preliminary acknowledge these states to be sovereign and independent. Congress represented the states in foreign affairs to protect their independence and sovereignty, not to override. Congressmen could claim no independent authority. Rather, the people of the states were in charge. Now, that vision of popular sovereignty became the most important interpretation of the Declaration during the early Republic because it shaped the Republican character of American governments during the early 19th century. Although less memorable than the beautiful language of the Declaration's opening paragraphs, the document's concepts of self-government were equally durable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tate, for helping us consider the origins of the Declaration and its powerful ideas about self-government. Now, our second presenter is Dr. Keith Pacholl. Dr. Pacholl has taught at the University of West Georgia since 2004. His areas of study include colonial America, the American Revolution, the early Republic, and American political, social, cultural, and religious history. His research examines the intersections of culture, religion, class, gender, consumerism, and print culture in the 18th century America. Dr. Pacholl will speak about religion and the Declaration of Independence. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Keith Pacholl.
I learned to keep myself on track, so I promise you I will keep myself on track with this. Welcome and thank you for having me here today. My talk is entitled Religion and the Declaration of Independence. So what I want you to do is transport yourself back into the 18th century, please, not in 2026, but in the 18th century. And we need to understand what religion meant to people of this time and how the Declaration factors into this. So I'm sure all of you in anticipation of today read your copy of the Declaration of Independence and reviewed it, right? My dad, who claimed that he had to memorize it, he was born in 1936, he had to memorize it. I asked him about it and he got the first line correct. So I was very proud of my dad. I forgot the rest of it since that time. So I want you to go back and in particular, what I want you to do is to think of how many religious references there are in the Declaration of Independence. Give you a second to think about it. Based on what you remember, how many references, religious references, are in the Declaration of Independence? Lock your number in. Are you ready to go? Let me show you what those are. The first one is, and I've highlighted where, and you'll see it in the beginning and the end of the document. The first one, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. That's number one. Number two comes right after that. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Number two, for those of you who guessed two, you're wrong. We continue on. Number three, down towards the bottom. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world. That is number three. And number four, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Now, how many of you guessed four? Well, I was hoping I'd get one hand at least, but now you know, and you can go drop this on someone else once you're done with this meeting today. There are four references, and that's it, just 4 lines. So the question is, what is the significance of these 4 lines? Nature's God, Supreme Judge, their Creator, and divine providence. What I want to do is offer you 3 takeaways to understand these words, which give you insight into religion in the 18th century. So that's what I want to do. And these 3 items I want to focus on, takeaways for you, is number 1, the impact of the Enlightenment. Number 2, their connection to religion and liberty. And number 3, the importance of millennialism and the United States as the new Jerusalem. I promise you I'll define millennialism a little bit later on, but we'll get to it. Those are the 3 takeaways. Those words, the significance, the import that they have, is what I want to discuss. So number 1, the Enlightenment. This is a nice brush up for some of you who remember studying it maybe a few years ago, a few decades ago, whatever it might be. I'm giving you a very unsatisfactory definition that I have a colleague who teaches an entire semester on this. But to give you some context for it, the Enlightenment, roughly speaking, is a philosophical and intellectual movement of the late 17th and 18th centuries that emphasize reason in understanding the universe and human behavior. Reason, rational thought, and logic, key words, very important in the course of the 18th century, and certainly in religion. And there will be some people, as the conversation about how do we apply these, I say here, universe and human behavior. Universe often means God, right? God's plan, natural laws, and then also human behavior. And so this comes in the form of what people understand as deism. And deism is a loaded phrase that is very broad in nature and encompasses a lot of actually different ideas. But I'm going to give you a definition from Henry May in his Enlightenment of America that says, deists believed that God acts in orderly, moral, and rational manner. His purpose was man's good. He had revealed both his own existence and nature and moral duties in the book of nature, and had given us faculties which made us able to read this book. So translated, reason is the key. And God is rational. So God should strive for the same rational approach in all areas of life. Humans should. Natural laws govern the universe. That's why you see nature's God appear, for example, and supreme judge and creator of these laws and so forth. It reflects that. But Thomas Jefferson, who wrote these words, understood there were people who didn't believe in this deist, rational, formulaic mindset that challenged traditional orthodoxy. So one thing I want you to keep in the back of your mind, he chose these knowing that these were also acceptable terms to mainstream Christians since they emphasized the importance and agency of God. In other words, no one really argued about these words, and everyone could find meaning and agree upon it. So they're trying to get this declaration written, and he wanted to make sure his choice of words would resonate with many, and indeed they did. So that's one aspect of what this document tells us about religion in the 18th century. But I also talked about religion and liberty and the connection of religion and liberty during this time. And what I would suggest to you is that Christianity helped frame the fight against tyranny during the American Revolution. For 18th century Americans, tyranny came in many forms, but two in particular I want to focus on are religious and political. How many of you have seen the seal of Thomas Jefferson that he created in 1790, which he stamped on most of his legal documents, which says rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. So for those who say Thomas Jefferson is an atheist, that's incorrect. Thomas Jefferson did believe in a God, and in fact, a God who sided with Americans. And he used this on his seal throughout the course of his life and his presidency as well. With that said, then, let me discuss religious tyranny. What did that mean to an 18th century American? And it all comes down to what we call established churches versus dissenting churches. So establishment means state support of a particular denomination. These benefits of an established church, if you're chosen as that established church, means you get tax money to support your ministers and to build new churches. You have to have license to preach in this established church, and there are boundaries for parishes. You can only preach in certain areas. Now, this existed in the American colonies, in over half of the American colonies. In New England, it was the Congregational Church that controlled, for instance, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. In the South, it's Anglicanism, the Church of England. So Maryland, Virginia, you have the Carolinas, for example, and also New York later on. There's several others as well. This meant their idea of things was we do this to establish unity and orthodoxy, because you got a lot of different people, especially with the Great Awakening, who start to challenge what that orthodoxy is. So these dissenting churches, what if you're not of the Congregational Church? What if you're not an Anglican? What if you're someone else? Well, the 18th century, with this idea of natural rights and liberties, gives you a chance to dissent, to challenge this. And indeed, that's what dissenting churches did in the 18th century. This included, by the way, Baptists, Methodists, Quakers beyond Pennsylvania, Catholics, and other groups who felt that their rights were violated by a state-supported church. And what was the violation of these rights? Religious liberty, the right to freely practice what you want without restriction. Not having to pay taxes to support another denomination. Not receiving a license to preach because they don't like the message you're preaching. Fines and imprisonment faced preachers coming, and this happened quite a bit. Some of you might know the story in Massachusetts Bay that several Quakers were hanged in the 1650s for coming and preaching without consent. Some of you might know in Virginia, for instance, Baptist ministers who were imprisoned and fined and not receiving licenses to preach. This is going strong when the Declaration of Independence is written. So for people, religious tyranny meant the freedom to practice what they want, But the other message as well, let me say this. 2 examples reinforce this. Some of you might be familiar with Thomas Jefferson. If you visited Monticello and you've seen his gravestone, you'll know that one of his things, there's 3 things he wants to be known for, and one of them was for a statute of religious freedom. And this in Virginia was a huge debate over whether or not the Anglican Church would continue on, now known as the Episcopal Church, after the American Revolution. And the answer was no, that people should be able to freely practice what they want. And I give you a quote from this. To compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. That's powerful language. And this is the state of Virginia saying this. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever. We do declare that the rights hereby asserted are the natural rights of mankind. There's that natural rights again, isn't it? It shows up over and over and over again. And if that doesn't compel you, how about the Constitution? As you probably know, there's no real many references about religion in the Constitution itself, other than Article 6, which says there shall be no religious test required as a qualification under any office or public trust of the United States. And then, of course, there's the First Amendment. Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This shows how this concern about established churches was part of the natural rights articulated in that declaration, what they had intended to do. Then there's a connection of these natural rights coming from God, and thus anyone who resists giving these rights is a tyrant. So natural rights are founded in God, not created by government. God guarantees freedom and liberty, so everyone's included in this, right? We're all created by God, so we're all entitled to those rights. Government must protect these rights, and violations of these rights then means disobedience to God. And if you disobey God, then you have the right to rebel against government that prevents you from practicing your faith correctly. Sam Adams was a big articulate on this particular point in his Rights of Colonists in 1772. He says, all persons born in British American colonies are, by the laws of God and nature and by common law of England, entitled to all natural, essential, inherent, and inseparable rights, liberties, and privileges of subjects born in Great Britain within this realm. In a sermon by John Allen, preached in 1772, he goes even further. He says, know this, the King of England has no more right according to the laws of God and nature to claim the lands of America than he has the lands of France. America and the native rights of Americans is the blood-bought treasure of their forefathers. Therefore, they who oppress Americans must be as great enemies to the right and laws of nature, which means who gave those rights? God, right? So you're an enemy to God then, if you do that. And so he continues on with this about tyranny and so forth. It's important then to see how these natural rights, they're rational rights. They apply to everyone, and anyone who stops, you have the right to rebel, that right to resistance. What makes the Declaration right? Because they're rebelling against a government that has tyranny, both religiously and politically. And then there's this idea of millennialism and the New Jerusalem. Millennium just simply means 1,000 years. So anytime you hear this in a religious context, there's meaning behind it. This refers to the end of times and the second coming of Christ, this 1,000-year reign, as theologians articulated. And in a very good book, God of Liberty, Kidd defines this as the belief that there is a period of peace and righteousness on earth associated with the second coming of Christ. But often this period of millennialism comes with a violent upheaval first. So people viewed the American Revolution as this violent upheaval that was going to bring a better time. This is all based on the book of Revelation. I'm sure there's a number of you who know your Bible and know the book of Revelation. And in chapter 21, verses 1 through 3, it talks about the coming of the holy city, coming out of the heaven from God, and where God will dwell among his people. And so this idea then is the United States is the New Jerusalem. This is something that is not new. For those of you who know something in American history and early colonization, you know a guy named John Winthrop wrote a very famous sermon, right? Entitled A Model of Christian Charity. to where he said New England was the one who was God's chosen country, right? And he says that we shall find God of Israel among us in New England, in Massachusetts Bay. He shall make us and praise and glory what all men say of succeeding plantations. May the Lord make it like that of New England. We must be considered as a city on a hill. But the American Revolution changed that narrative and basically says, no, the United States now is the new Jerusalem. It ain't just New England now, it is the United States proper. And so in this sermon by Ebenezer Baldwin, Duty of Rejoicing Under Calamities in 1775, I would suppose these colonies to be the foundation of a great and mighty empire, the largest the world ever saw, to be founded on such principles of liberty and freedom, both civil and religious, as never took place in the world, which shall be a part of the seat of that glorious kingdom which Christ shall erect on earth in the latter days. In other words, here it comes with the revolution. So the United States now, by declaring its independence, has created the new age here on earth. What does all this mean? I have about 30 seconds to summarize it for you, and so I shall. That those living during the American Revolution, religion provided a framework for understanding meaning and intent behind the words of the Declaration of Independence. They understood what those words meant and the gravity of those words. They understood that their cause was a rational one, fought to protect their rights and freedoms. The liberties were guaranteed by the highest authority, that of God. This conflict thus took on the tones of a holy war that protected God, what God had given them, and rejected the yoke of oppression. And finally, their success would result in the creation of a new nation that would serve as a beacon for the rest of the world. They would be implementing God's plan for humanity. If you don't believe me, let me sum up with who you can never argue with. And that, of course, is George Washington. Washington. In a letter written in June 1783, he said, "The foundation of our empire was not laid in the gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but an epoch when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than any former period. Welcome to the Enlightenment. The citizens of America are from this period to be considered actors in the most conspicuous theater, which seems to be peculiarly designated by Providence for the display of human greatness. Heaven has crowned all of its other blessings by giving a fairer opportunity for political happiness than any other nation has ever been favored with. If their citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault will be theirs, entirely their own." And that's the story of U.S. history later on, which I can't get into, but I have some reading suggestions for you if you are interested in learning more about this. These are 3 great books that really underlie much of what I say. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pacholl, for that thoughtful perspective on religion and the Declaration of Independence. Remember, 4 references. We'll never forget that. Our final presenter is Dr. Jeff Rogers, Professor of History at Gordon State College. Dr. Rogers has taught at Gordon State College since 2004. He specializes in 19th century Southern intellectual history, and his teaching interests include the early American Republic and 19th century America. Dr. Rogers will speak about how the Declaration of Independence was remembered in the South during the antebellum period. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff Rogers.
Thank all of you for having me, and thank Adam for inviting me to be a part of Clayton State University. This is a wonderful event, and I'm very honored to be a part of it. My topic is a little more focused than just the antebellum South broadly. I'm going to focus on one antebellum Southerner in particular, and I think a very important one for understanding this topic, and that's William Gilmore Simms. Has anybody here ever heard of William Gilmore Simms before? All right, well, you're gonna learn about it. The title of my talk is William Gilmore Simms, The Spirit of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. Now, there's a common notion one encounters when Americans consider the place of the Declaration of Independence in American life in the decades prior to the Civil War. that in their efforts to justify the institution of slavery, to defend their slave-based social and economic order, antebellum Southerners came to reject the principles of the Declaration with its stirring affirmation of all men are created equal, and instead articulated a vision of a society that became anti-egalitarian and anti-democratic. In other words, in order to defend slavery, Southerners were forced to reject the principles of the Declaration, something they did reluctantly or eagerly, depending on the telling. But in doing so, they in some sense rendered themselves and their society outside the mainstream of American history and identity. There's a lot we could unpack here, but for our purposes, it's useful to notice that at bottom, this is an interpretation that, like all historical interpretations, attempts to explain historical phenomena in a way that is intelligible to the one expressing it and to ones who may hear it. Even without many details, there's a rudimentary narrative here, arranged in such a way and using particular terminology that, depending on your philosophy of history, either imparts meaning to this phenomenon or draws out or discovers the meaning inherent in that phenomenon, but which is not obvious unless interpreted. What's especially noteworthy is that it's an evaluation that proceeds from a decided and confident understanding of the Declaration of Independence. And it's certainly in its centrality that allows it to serve as a standard by which to make valuative judgments about a time, a place, and a people. Now, leave aside for a moment the veracity or falseness of that judgment. Notice what matters from this viewpoint is getting things right with the Declaration of Independence, because at a deep and most fundamental level, the Declaration of Independence profoundly matters on this view. Americans have been wrestling with the Declaration for a very long time because they have sensed that importance and have believed that in those 1,337 words of text, depending on how you add them up, lies a key to the meaning and purpose of the American experience. But herein lies the rub. Because the stakes are so high, the arguments over the meaning and preferred understanding of the Declaration of Independence have been long, intense, and wide-ranging. In short, maybe the greatest legacy of the Declaration of Independence has been those arguments. The fact that Americans, and not only Americans, have vigorously, sometimes viciously, argued over it. And in those arguments have attempted to make sense of themselves, the country in which they live. This shouldn't be a controversial assertion, as the Declaration itself was born from arguments between Britain and her American colonies, and, along with affirmations of equality and unalienable rights, it consists substantially of grievances and accusations leveled at George III. This habit of arguing about the Declaration of Independence is certainly no less true of historians than anyone else, although we might want to distinguish the approach historians are supposed to take as opposed to political partisans. The latter seek to use the document for immediate rhetorical purposes, while there certainly are partisan historians, the former is supposed to attempt an interpretation that places the Declaration in the context of the American Revolution and history more broadly. Historian Barry Allen Shane identifies at least 7 different schools of interpretation that find in the Declaration of Independence, and especially its luminous second paragraph, the groundings of American political thought and the seminal expressions of an American creed. But with all of them, of course, doing so within their broader understanding of the Revolutionary era itself. For the historian, then, to understand the Declaration of Independence is to understand it within the context of the revolution which produced it. Were the founders motivated by Enlightenment liberalism and natural rights philosophy? If so, you can certainly find that expressed in the Declaration. Or were they less 18th century liberals influenced by, say, John Locke and more classical Republicans who read Cicero, Livy, and James Harrington? One can read the Declaration through that interpretive lens as well. Perhaps the real issue was a strictly narrow and insular dispute over the boundaries of power within the British constitutional order, an Anglo-American family quarrel of sorts. You can find evidence for this in the Declaration. Was there a distinctly evangelical Protestant flavor to the American grievances against Parliament and Crown? Did it all start with the Great Awakening? What if the revolution was less a battle between competing political philosophies than one between social and economic classes vying for dominance, with the Declaration merely serving as a rhetorical function to justify or mask one group's power over others? Or perhaps it was some combination, greater or lesser, of all of these. If the Declaration can be read from these perspectives as well. Regardless, to understand the American Revolution, again, you have to get right with the Declaration of Independence. Interestingly, though, it doesn't seem to have started out this way. To quote historian Pauline Maier, considering how revered a position the Declaration of Independence later won in the hearts and minds of the American people, their disregard for it in the earliest years of the nation verges on the incredible. In the decades immediately followed the conclusion of the war in 1783, the Declaration actually receded somewhat in the American consciousness. The political reality of independence, won through 8 long years of war, was celebrated, but the actual text of the Declaration was less often the focus of those celebrations. This was especially the case once the Constitution was ratified. It was the Constitution that loomed larger for Americans during the Federalist and Jeffersonian periods because the immediate political issues they confronted, assumption of state debts, the Bank of the United States, tariffs and economic development, foreign policy, and territorial expansion, so clearly raised contentious questions of constitutional interpretation. Occasionally, the Declaration became a subject of partisan bickering between Federalist and Democratic Republican political factions, but it hinged as often on debates over the extent of Jefferson's authorship of the Declaration and the originality of his phraseology in the text, than in whose policies most aligned with the principles expressed in the Declaration. Shifting some of the credit for the Declaration away from Jefferson, the principal leader of the Republicans, and onto John Adams, or a Federalist, or diffusing it throughout the Continental Congress through its revisions, seemed politically useful at the time to some Federalists. Following the War of 1812, Americans seemed to rediscover their revolutionary history. An eruption of interest brought forth book after book, article after article, speech after speech on all things connected with the Revolution. A new generation, too young to have meaningfully participated in the momentous events of that time, was now on the rise, while the last of the founding generation was beginning to pass from the scene. Once estranged, but at last reconciled friends, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, both died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of American independence, the adoption of the Declaration, an occurrence of heart-tugging symbolism for Americans as they remembered the birth of their republic. It dawned on Americans that soon the spirit of 76 would no longer be accessible by living memory, but only through the medium of history. It was now imperative for Americans to remember this history, to document it, to preserve its records and stories, to tell those stories, and most importantly, to understand what it all meant. Doing precisely this was a lifelong passion of William Gilmore Simms. Born in Charleston in 1806, Simms was the preeminent literary figure of the antebellum South and one of the most important American authors of the 19th century. At the center of his literary life was a fascination with the revolutionary struggle, born from the exciting tales told to him by his grandmother, who as a teenage girl had served as a Patriot spy along the Cooper River in South Carolina. She told him of his grandfather also, who had fought in the war. These blood connections doubtless made this history all the more tangible for him and helped inspire his life's calling. Alone among American authors of the 19th century, Simms perceived a national literary need that America's history be portrayed in fiction, set out to satisfy this need. Prior to his death in 1870, had largely accomplished his mission. From the beginning of Spanish exploration by De Soto in 1539 to the settlement of the Southwest frontier in his own day, Sims set multiple novels in what he considered the 4 major periods of American history. Of his 26 major works of fiction, 8 were set in his native South Carolina during what he considered the most critical period of American life, the Revolution. In these novels, Sims depicted in compelling and realistic detail the social and political upheaval of the Revolution, the violent conflict between patriots and Tories in the Southern theater of the war, and the complexities inherent in the reformation of society in the post-war period. No other American writer did more to develop the genre of historical fiction than Sims. And of all 19th century American authors, none thought more often or thought more deeply about the uses of history for the purposes of fiction than Sims. And he excelled at making his literary efforts successful artistically, while also remaining true to the historical settings and circumstances they portrayed. He was able to do this because Sims was, as historian Sean Busick has called him, also the central figure in historical studies, working in the South prior to the Civil War. Among his 8 historical works are A History of South Carolina, which treated extensively its revolutionary past, and 4 biographies, including one of General Nathanael Greene, and probably his best overall work of history, a biography of the legendary swamp fox, General Francis Marion. Sims was also a relentless book and manuscript collector, whose collection he estimated in 1862 to be roughly 10,000 books and 50 bound and printed volumes of manuscripts, including documents from the hands of George Washington, John Jay, Richard Henry Lee, John Rutledge, the Baron von Steuben, and other luminaries, but most especially Henry Lawrence and his famous son, John. Sims did exhaustive research for his biographies. In his Marion biography, published in 1844, for example, Poe thought Sims was the best American author at the time. But in his Marion biography, published in 1844, Sims used written sources that are apparently no longer extant, and even interviewed old veterans who had served under Marion, under his command and doing well. That faithfulness to evidence and method was equally present in Sims's fictional works, although he did allow himself creative license to write compelling stories. To these, we could add numerous reviews, essays, and poems on revolutionary themes and topics. All of this is to say that Sims was part of that post-war of 1812 generation, whose imaginations and whose patriotism was set aflame with a desire to memorialize the revolution and its heroes. And there was no one during his lifetime who could rightly claim a deeper knowledge of or love for that history, and none who did more to promote its study. We're asking then, what did Sims, this prominent Southern literary and intellectual, believe about the Revolution and its signature expression in words, the Declaration of Independence? Like many of his 19th century contemporaries, Sims read history as the unfolding story of human progress. For Sims, however, progress was not according to historical laws, nor was it inevitable. His understanding of history was dialectical, but it wasn't at all like Marx's dialectical materialism. In fact, materialism in all its forms was anathema to Sims. Students of Sims have described his philosophy of history as statalist, a belief that human societies develop by stages, right? Hunting and gathering, agriculture, and finally the stage of commerce. However, somewhat unlike the Scottish statalists, historians who are identified with this perspective, Sims's notion of progress was the growth of civilization more broadly, the maturation and development of the arts, literature, religion, the maturation and eventually fulfillment of self-government. This type of progress was often facilitated by economic and technological progress, but wasn't synonymous with it. Progress could also become a liability if it was measured solely in material terms. Right? Qualitative progress, the type of progress that Sims prized the most, was slow, halting, and tenuous. It's not possible without social and political order. which in turn was generated only when the fundamental institutions of society were functioning properly relative to the individual and to each other. Chief among these were the family and the community. When these institutions failed, a conflict, revolution, and a new stage of social development was the result. And for Sims, this is exactly what happened in America from 1765 to 1783. The goal of his lifelong literary labors was to illuminate in both history and fiction the working out of deep-seated, developing historical forces, which led to the birth of a new American nation distinct from its sources. Like other 19th century intellectuals, Sims saw nationalism, for that's really the best term to use, as a progressive force, freeing people from oppressions, but most importantly for Sims, allowing people to pursue self-government, collective virtue, and to fulfill the potential for cultural expression. This was a nationalism, however, of home, rooted in local and familial attachments, a love for and dedication to a particular people in a particular place, being a necessary and healthy feature of human life. It was, in fact, Sims argued in his 1843 oration, The Social Principle, the principle of home. That was the very foundation of the revolution. He contrasts the experiences of the French, the Spanish, and the English in terms of colonization, and finds in the English expression or the English process of colonization something completely different, in that English colonists came seeking homes, to establish homes, right? Now, ever the Southerner, when it comes to comparing this process of English colonization, Sims described the Puritans of New England as fierce, intractable, an intractable sect, restive under any rules, sullen and dogged, rude and stubborn. But they also had, quote, that hearty English sense of the social virtues, which is the true bond of union by which a nation is strengthened for gigantic purposes. As for the Cavaliers of Virginia or Carolina, he added that they too longed for the sacred character of home. And thus American colonists built their homes along the familiar patterns of English law and custom, all the while maturing into something uniquely American. And so, says Sims, it was no difficult matter when in 76, the mother country prepared to violate their social securities, to awaken the whole people from Maine to Georgia to the necessity of making a common cause in quarrel. As successive acts of Parliament came to threaten those social securities, it awoken something beyond mere opposition to them. Here Sims speaks directly to the significance of the Declaration in his unfolding story. It is well to remark in support of this opinion that in our Declaration of Independence, the wrongs done, the provocations suffered, are spoken of only as so many aggressions upon society. And the understanding is never for a moment outraged or offended by a single abstraction about that liberty, which, save in name, is nothing more than a spirit of refined society. They shook themselves free from the King of Great Britain for the same reason which first prompted them to seek refuge in the wilderness, the comfort and security of home. For Sims, the Declaration of Independence wasn't merely a declaration of grievances. It was an act of an already independent people. It's a rhetorical exaggeration, he claimed, to speak of British taxation only as the cause of our Revolutionary War. I do not doubt that we should, in process of time, have dissolved our connection with the mother country under any circumstances, in any sort of treatment. It was not in the nature of things that the two countries should very long remain under the same authority. However, says Sims, we have but to read the famous instrument to which we have given passing reference to see that the wrongs done by Great Britain are dwelt upon as wrongs to people rather than principles, to the repose and security of society rather than that elementary principle of human equality which the same instrument begins with declaring that indeed was the principle made apparent by the wrong, yet but for the wrong, the principle might have slept for ages in the dormant bosom of the savage or the slave. So for Sims, the Declaration of Independence was the fulfillment of centuries of social growth and the expression of a people now fully conscious and self-aware, prepared to embark upon their own story within the family of nations. So certainly for this Southern intellectual, there was no contradiction between, as he saw it, the society in which he inhabited and the principles of the Declaration, because he saw in that society its own growth and maturation. All right, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rogers, for introducing us to William Gilmore Simms and his interpretation of the Declaration of Independence. Definitely going on my to read, look him up and read him. Okay, now what we have is those of you that have written questions on your note cards, can you please pass them down here and Robin will take them from you. We'll have a few questions. And then at the end, we will have a wonderful closing remark with Clayton State University President Dr. George Lewis. So if you could pass them down, our panelists have kindly agreed to talk to you after the event. So you have the microphone right there. Oh, okay. This is for Dr. Tate. Would France or anyone else who wants to, answer, would France have helped in the fight with the colonies without the prior assistance given by Benjamin Franklin?
I would simply say that certainly Franklin is trying to advocate very vigorously for French assistance because he figures that there's no way that the Americans are going to be able to overcome British funding, the British Army, which is one of the biggest in the world, without French assistance. He's also playing on the hope that France will want to avenge its loss in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian Wars, it's called in the colonies. And so certainly Franklin lobbies very vigorously for this. That's why he's so important during the Revolution. And so I would definitely say, was Ben Franklin a necessary component to the French alliance? Probably yes. It's kind of hard if you take him out of that. I don't know. I mean, he was such a celebrity, maybe the first American celebrity, if you will, and the French loved him. And so that was kind of his moment, if you will, to advocate for the United States.
Thank you. Do the other panelists have anything to add?
I don't know if you can hear it now, but okay. So I would just agree. One thing to keep in the back of your mind is the French and Indian War ended in 1763. And that was the colonists with Great Britain fighting against France. So you would think, why 10 years later would France want to join? And there were some in France who just said, let them crush each other. This is great. Let them destroy, and then we can move back in. But I think sometimes there are other individuals like Count Vergennes, for instance, who was kind of like the Secretary of State at the time, who saw this as an opportunity to tweak the British. And so by playing it off, so Ben Franklin was very good at picking those things up, but there was a sentiment in France as well that this is an opportunity for payback for the French and Indian War. So anything we can do with the form of ammunition and aid and so forth. And it takes several years before they signed the alliance. So I think there's other factors. So I think Franklin is crucial to this, but I think that there was already this thing. This is our chance to get back at Great Britain as well.
Yeah, I just would reiterate what I've said. I mean, maybe an answer to the question, but the French had plenty of grievances and reasons to, I should say, tweak the British. So their interests were certainly, they were cognizant of their interest in the struggle. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right. This is interesting. What may not include women in all created equal, etc.? Who wants to take that one on?
Now, if I had more than 15 minutes. Is the application, some of you are probably familiar with this great correspondence between Abigail and John, right? And it's, what about the women? And she's like, this is great, John, but men have treated women with this abuse of authority tyranny for some time. Why aren't you going to do something for us? And he's all, wait a minute, woman, let's hold up, not quite just yet. We need to get independence first, then maybe we will get here. But what I love about it is these words will inspire that movement among women. In fact, when you see in the first generation, there are women who are going to say, we need to recalculate. There are things that come out, it's like Republican motherhood and so forth. But what I love is a couple of generations later, is you have Seneca Falls. And their Declaration of Sentiments is the exact rewording of the Declaration of Independence. All men and women are created equal, and they do the play on this. And so I think that this is still a very traditional society. Women are not actively involved in politics in the traditional sense of things. But when you look at the coming of the revolution, women are in the streets. You think of the Stamp Act, for instance, riots and so forth. Women are doing spinning bees and so forth to show their support for these things. And when men go away to fight, who runs the farms? It's women. So women are very actively involved with it. But the Declaration is not going to take them into consideration necessarily. It's primarily white men that they are referring to. And we can certainly talk about this about slavery and the impact as well. But that's a whole other story for another time. Not another time, another talk.
Yeah, I don't think there were many delegates who even were thinking along those lines as those words were expressed. The Declaration is one of those things where something that's, again, produced in a specific context and at a specific time, or a specific set of purposes, over time can get repurposed, right? And people reuse it. And there's an international context to the Declaration. The Declaration of Independence is one of the most influential documents ever written. I mean, it has literally been read by hundreds of millions of people, since 1776, and it has inspired many of these people in lots of ways, right? In ways that we might think are wonderful and great, maybe in ways that we don't think are wonderful and great, right? So it's interesting to think about how the words of the text. Of course, one of the interesting things to me is that people love the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, and then they kind of trail off, right? I mean, it's the rest of the document. Oh, yeah, well, what's all this? I don't know. Let's go back and read about all men are created equal. And there's more to it than that, right? But it's an example again of how words uttered in one context can be interpreted and read and used by other people at different times and different places, right?
Thank you. Okay, for the sake of time, I apologize. We only have like one more question. However, our historians, I'm sure, will be happy afterwards to answer your questions. Okay, we heard of the communal mood and a decision through Congress, but there were a good number of Tories. Right? How did they figure into this representational argument?
That's a great question. In fact, was of course argued about at the time. And so as the Americans are establishing revolutionary committees and governments in a number of the colonies, they're trying to force people to take loyalty oaths to the colony because they want to know, you want to make sure they know whose side you're on. And if you're not, and you violate the association, the import ban or so forth, they're going to take issue with you. So this was pointed out, there's a number of contemporary writings one of them, diary from a Scottish woman who was in Wilmington, North Carolina. Scott, I think it's the last name. Anyway, but she has all of these comments about how hypocritical the Americans are appealing to free speech and rights when they're throwing Tories out of the city and telling them to get out of the colony. So yeah, this is a problem, right? How do you account for minorities within your majoritarian system? This is a huge issue, of course, that we still deal with today. It's part and parcel of the system, and it was brought up at the time. So that's a great question.
And I would just simply, thanks for that answer. I think it covers a lot of what needs to be said. Is this just to not apply equally, right? Sometimes they say the victors write history. Well, the reality is loyalists and the histories of loyalists really didn't start to come into their own until the 1960s and 1970s. So they were generally left out as people who hated what was going on, who were these monarchists and so forth. But when you actually look at some loyalists, there is a wide spectrum of who these people are. They just aren't rich merchants. There's a lot of people who are loyalists. And some of these are saying, wait, you're tarring and feathering people, you're throwing tea overboards, which is actually paid for property. And so you're violating other people's rights as well. But that kind of gets pushed to the side in the fighting and the war and so forth. But I would say there's a lot of good books that have come out in the last 20 to 30 years on loyalists for those of you who are interested that will give you a whole new perspective on it. So I think these questions are great.
Yeah, I mean, this serves to remind us, when we think about the revolution, we're very much focused on this process whereby, Americans achieve a kind of unity, right? That's the overarching theme, right? These 13 disparate colonies that come together, it's all like unity, common purpose. But the American Revolution was a time of great disunity, of great conflict, and for a long time, and again, up till recently, the scholars have really explicated this, but incredibly violent, a lot of violence, personal violence, one-on-one violence, in addition to large-scale, warfare. But and that's something maybe that Americans, at least, in the recent past, haven't really been as fully aware of, is just how bloody and violent the American Revolution really was.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tate, Dr. Pacholl, and Dr. Rogers. This was wonderful. Now, before we go and have our cake, for our wonderful closing remarks, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Clayton State University President Dr. George Lewis.
Penny, and apologies because I'm the person evidently that's in between you and cake. So I won't take that long. Thank you, Penny, and for anyone and everyone who was responsible for having this event. I don't know all the people who were part of organizing it, but I definitely want to acknowledge them. So let's all acknowledge all those folks. So welcome to Georgia Archive. And on behalf of the 6,400 scholars and growing, and all of our faculty and staff here at Clayton State University, if you were across the street, I would say welcome to Clayton State University as well. And so it's so good to see each and every one of you. As I'm looking around and wondering who is in this audience, because those questions made me a little bit nervous. My goodness gracious. So thank you, Penny, for taking those questions with you and not leaving them for me. But it's clear that we have an expert audience here as well. So it's good to see each and every one of you, and you're welcome back as much or as often as you want to be on our campus and at the archives. And so to Doctors Tate and Pacholl, am I saying that correct? Dr. Pacholl, Dr. Rogers, 2004 was a good year for the university system. If you listen to their bios, they all started in 2004. That is outstanding. And so thank you for your expertise, for your scholarship, and sharing with each and every one of us today. Let's give them another round of applause. Just have a couple things for you, but as we reflect on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, we are reminded that it is more than a declaration of political freedom. It was a statement of aspiration. It was a belief that every person possesses inherent worth and should have the opportunity to pursue a better future. 250 years later, our responsibility is not to simply celebrate those ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but to advance them. At Clayton State University, our mission is social mobility. And so we believe education remains one of the most powerful ways to transform lives, strengthen communities, and expand opportunities for future generations. So that's our avenue. That's what we believe. The Declaration challenged America to live up to its highest principles. In higher education, we carry the work forward every day by opening doors, by creating pathways to success, and by helping students realize their full potential. As we commemorate this anniversary, may we renew our commitment to ensuring that the promise of opportunity remains alive and accessible, not for some, but for all. And so before you leave today, I just encourage you to take a moment to view Georgia's copy of the Declaration of Independence that is displayed on our first floor. This is a rare opportunity to experience firsthand a document that is so central to our nation's history. I also want to extend my sincere, as I mentioned earlier, sincere appreciation to the Georgia Archives for making this event possible today. So as we approach the 4th of July, I hope you carry forward what you have learned today. Thank you, gentlemen, what you have learned today. As you gather with your family and with your friends, take the opportunity to reflect on the true meaning of this historic document and share its significance with others. So thank you again for being here, to each and every one of you, for engaging in this important conversation and for your continued commitment to the values that unite all of us who are here today and beyond. So I wish you a safe and a meaningful holiday and enjoy your cake. Thank you for being here.